John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate. As the Minister pointed out, I was the Secretary of State at the time that the licence fee settlement was agreed with the BBC, and so I would like to set out some of the reasons why those decisions were reached. As the opposition spokesman said, the concessionary TV licence for over 75s is not a fundamental pillar of the welfare state. It was actually only introduced by the last Labour government. It was introduced to address what was an anomaly, that people, elderly people living in sheltered housing didn't have to pay the full licence fee, whereas others did. But the Labour government did not introduce free TV licences for all pensioners on the basis that it was far too expensive to do so. So they restricted it to those aged over 75 at a cost at that time of £365 million. Now, it is important to realise that that money wasn't removed from the BBC, it was given to the BBC by the Department of Work and Pensions. And it has always been the case since then that the cost of exemption from the TV licence is met out of the government's budget. And the cost to the government of doing so has risen steadily, so that last year it had already reached £660 million. Now, I had the task of both negotiating the new BBC Charter and the licence fee settlement. Personally, I would have much preferred that the licence fee had been included within the Charter negotiations, since the licence fee settlement to some extent preempted decisions that we took as a result of the Charter review process. But the Minister, opening the debate, was absolutely right to point out that we were in very difficult financial circumstances, thanks to the profligacy of the previous Labour government. We had to take a lot of very difficult decisions, and the Chancellor was clear that we should seek to achieve savings from the BBC as a publicly owned institution funded by the government in the same way that all other public institutions were being asked to find savings. And so we agreed with the BBC that they would take over the cost of funding the licence fee concession. However, we were also clear that we had given a pledge that the concession would be maintained until 2020, and therefore that was the agreement with the BBC, that they would take it over in 2020. Now, I have to say to the House that the negotiations with the BBC over that were indeed robust. I can remember sitting down with the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, and George Osborne, with Lord Hall as the Director General of the BBC, and we had some good discussions in which he argued forcibly that this would have a detrimental impact on the BBC, and therefore, in recognition of that, we also included, as part of the licence fee settlement, agreement to address some of the things the BBC raised as their principal concerns. One was the freeze in the licence fee. The licence fee had not gone up at all for a number of years, and therefore the BBC was looking at a real terms reduction every year. We agreed that the licence fee should be unfrozen. Secondly, there was a growing number of people who were avoiding paying the licence fee by actually watching the BBC through the iPlayer on catch-up, and actually if you watched it by a mere 2 minutes after the live transmission, under the law as it then stood, you didn't have to pay the licence fee. And so the licence fee was extended to close what was called the iPlayer loophole.
Would my right honourable friend give way?
Of course I could.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with the Director General of the BBC at that time, Lord Hall, still the Director General of the BBC, that the funding arrangements that he and the previous Prime Minister David Cameron put in place with the BBC represented a fair deal? Would he agree with that?
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend because he allows me to quote the Director General, who said actually at the end of the negotiations that we had, and as I say they were robust, but we emerged from those with the BBC issuing a public statement saying it is the right deal in difficult economic circumstances. And the Director General went on to say, far from being a cut, the way this financial settlement is shaped gives us effectively flat licence fee income across the first 5 years of the next charter.
And so, of course,
I don't know whether he's going to list it as part of the licence fee deal, but it's worth making the point, first of all, that the last Labour government imposed on the licence fee a levy to fund broadband rollout, and also that because of the success of the broadband rollout under our government, we removed that levy from the BBC. So while there was a stick with free TV licences, there were carrots in removing some of the things the BBC had been asked to subsidise by the last government.
I'm very grateful to my right friend, of course, who was also a key player at that time as a minister in the department, and he's absolutely right. I mentioned two of the BBC's requests at that time, the unfreezing of the licence fee and the closure of the loophole, but he's absolutely correct to point out that the BBC had always been unhappy about the top slicing of a licence fee to fund broadband, which they saw as far removed from the purpose of the licence fee, and so that was another agreement which we reached with them. And that was why the BBC, I think, did feel that it was a fair and proper settlement. I can wait for the honourable gentleman.
the right honourable member for giving way. He's implying that the BBC were happy with all this at the time, but in the press statement announcing the consultation on this, the BBC said, and I quote, "The BBC could copy the scheme, but we think it would fundamentally change the BBC because of the scale of service cuts we would need to make." Those are not the statements of an organisation which thinks it can easily absorb this.
The agreement with the BBC was that they would have the responsibility of maintaining or amending the licence fee concession. And what he has quoted is the BBC's view about the cost of maintaining it as it presently stands. And one has to say that it is understandable, since the cost next year will be £745 million, and that is going to rise to £1.06 billion by 2029-30. And therefore I'm not at all surprised that the opposition spokesman was unable to give any commitment that a future Labour government would maintain it at the cost of the taxpayer, since it would be a £1 billion public expenditure pledge. So the BBC, in recognition of that, have put forward three different options. They've talked about continuation, which, as the honourable gentleman has said, they feel is not realistic. It would amount to the current cost of BBC 2, BBC 3, BBC 4, the news channel, CBBCs and CBBC, all put together. Or they have suggested some amendment to it, or its discontinuation, or its discontinuing it altogether. Now, the three possible amendments that they have suggested to the licence fee concession, each of them has some attraction. They have talked about possibly raising the limit, the age limit, to 77 or 80, which to some extent would reflect the ageing population, so it would maintain it at roughly the same proportion. A second possibility would be to introduce a discounted fee, so people over 75 would not have to pay the full cost any longer. I give way to my old friend.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend, an excellent neighbour, for giving way his excellent speech. A lot of my constituents in Chelmsford have emailed me who are over 75 and want to continue to watch the TV with the free licence, but they're not necessarily also watching the BBC on the multiple other devices that many other younger people are. So would there be a case that he could see for older members of the public to still be able to watch via a single device, whereas younger members may watch multiple devices? Does that sort of system work? Thank you.
Just to say, reiterate, there is pressure on time. Interventions need to be short, but I'm sure the honourable member will be.
I will, of course, take account of your guidance, Madam Deputy Speaker, but my honourable friend does raise an interesting point, which I want to just touch on as I conclude my remarks. But the third possible amendment would be to limit the concession to those in receipt of pension credit. And that would actually address a lot of the concerns expressed by honourable members opposite, of those on very low incomes who would find it hard to afford. And it would introduce an element of targeting to ensure that those who will struggle to afford the television licence would no longer have to do so. But there is another change, which actually I would ask the BBC to consider, which is not included in their options. And that is, at the moment, households are entitled to a free television licence if a member of the household is over 75. It is absolutely ridiculous that it may have 4 adults of working age all bringing in an income, and yet because they happen to have had their grandmother come and live with them, they don't have to pay a television licence. And therefore a simple change, which would be to restrict the concession to those households which only consist of people aged over 75. And so I would ask that the BBC perhaps consider that as well. But I do want to just end, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that this does raise some fundamental questions too about the future of the licence fee. Viewing habits are changing, as my honourable friend indicated. Evasion of the TV licence is rising. It has gone up from 5.2% in 2010 to an estimated 7% now. And that is with the advent of new services such as Netflix and Amazon, and soon possibly Apple Television and Disney, and the old argument that every household needs to pay the licence fee because the BBC is watched by everybody, I'm afraid is beginning to break down. And we are reaching a position where many households may actually watch the huge range of programmes available and never turn to the BBC. And that is why I have always believed that in the long term, the licence fee is not sustainable. That was something that we addressed at the beginning of the Charter Review. It is recognised by the Director General, who has also said that we need to look at alternative models. He has introduced the possibility of introducing new services which are subscription on iPlayer. And therefore, whilst at the moment there is no alternative to the licence fee, because we don't have a system whereby you can cut off people who choose not to pay it, that was the problem as to why we reached the conclusion the licence fee had to be maintained. In the longer term, that is no longer going to be true. And there will come a time when I don't think that the licence fee can be sustained. But that will be the task of the future Secretary of of State who has the job of undertaking the next Charter review.
Roy Rimmer.